Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Bull Take Scouting Podcast. Today, we've got a pretty unique episode where we're going to go position by position and analyze whether or not, if we had this position as a need for a hypothetical franchise, if we'd be addressing it in the draft or in free agency. And so let's start off with quarterback. And the caveat here is that the free agent class is kind of underwhelming, headlined by names like Jameis Winston, Marcus Mariota, Teddy Bridgewater, Mitch Trubisky. But then outside of that, there's been a lot of talk of potential trade targets, the big names like Aaron Rodgers, Deshaun Watson, Russell Wilson, some of the lesser starters like Carson Wentz and Jimmy Garoppolo. So all things considered, Alex, if you were in need of a franchise quarterback, and I know it varies depending on situation, but generally, would you be looking towards the veteran market or the NFL draft this year?
I think this year is honestly really tough. I mean, obviously, I think any team would want to trade for a guy like Russell Wilson or Aaron Rodgers, but that's just not realistic for most teams. Um, and I think maybe we should think about really quickly: do either of those guys actually end up getting traded? Because I know we've heard Rodgers was wanted out in the past. There kind of seems to be some momentum building towards maybe him staying in Green Bay. And if you really think about it, where could he go that's a better situation than Green Bay right now? I know they've let him down in the past. I feel like he let them down on their playoff loss to San Francisco as well. But the teams that have probably the best supporting casts, maybe Denver, but does he really want to go play in a division with Mahomes and Herbert? That could be really tough. Maybe Tampa, but I don't think he wants to follow in Brady's footsteps. So it's really tough. So maybe Rodgers ends up staying put, but here's how I would put it. If I was a team that was like ready to win now with a plethora of talent besides a quarterback, I would trade for one of these top guys. I would do what I can to trade for Rodgers, do what I can to trade for Wilson. But really, other than that, if I was a rebuilding team, I think there are some quarterbacks in the draft that I think have good potential to be franchise quarterbacks, like a guy like Matt Corral, Kenny Pickett, maybe Malik Willis in the right situation. So it's really tough. It's kind of, split down the middle. If you're a team that's ready to win now, has all the supporting cast, I'd trade for a quarterback. If I was a team that was rebuilding, I'd draft one.
My slight issue with that is that I think if you're a rebuilding team and you're picking high in the draft order, I'm starting to think that the value really isn't there. And originally, I thought looking at the Giants and the Panthers' quarterback situation, where I'm really confident that neither team has their quarterback of the future on their roster currently. I thought, I like Matt Corral. It's an underwhelming quarterback class, but he's my QB1. If I were either of those teams, I would pick Corral. But just with hindsight, having watched Corral now about 2 months ago, I don't know about picking him that high. And looking at the potential draft scenarios for those teams, you got the Panthers who are in so much need of offensive line reinforcements. They could pick Charles Cross and just wait on quarterback. Obviously, that regime might not have that much time, but if you throw my QB1 Matt Corral in there behind a horrible offensive line, and we know he has some durability concerns, it's just not going to work out. The Giants, I don't believe in Daniel Jones, but if you look at the pair of picks they could make in the top 10 outside of quarterback, they could make that team so much better. Hypothetically, let's just say Kayvon Thibodeau and Charles Cross, for example, would be a huge step forward as a franchise. So part of me there thinks, these rebuilding teams that are picking so high in the draft order where quarterback's a little bit of a reach, maybe they should just wait on that position.
Yeah, I would kind of tend to agree with you there. If we were given the choice to either free agency, draft, or wait, I would probably lean towards the wait, especially if you're a team that's in the top 10. Now, if I was a team maybe like Washington and I couldn't get any of the free agent quarterbacks, then I would think about, maybe taking a guy like Matt Corral. They do have a decent offensive line, so I think he could be well protected there. They have good running back, good wide receivers, a good defense. So that would be an interesting spot for a rookie quarterback to land, or even Pittsburgh. I know their offensive line isn't what it was a few years ago, but a guy like Malik Willis, maybe he could end up sitting a year behind, a stopgap quarterback like Mason Rudolph, and then him coming in next year with that really good Steelers defense. We know they always find really good wide receivers in the draft as well. So I think, maybe if I was a team like Washington or Pittsburgh, I might go the route of a rookie quarterback. If I can't get one of those veterans that could be traded for, but I agree with you. Towards the top, maybe stay away from quarterback. And we've talked about this multiple times. The quarterback class potential for next year is very, very good.
I agree with you there that I think Washington is where I'd start strongly considering taking the first quarterback off the board. And just to circle back to the veteran market, I think you're right in speculating that at the end of the day, Wilson and Rodgers might stay where they are. I think those teams are going to command way too much for other teams to go in. And there's such a select few teams that have the pieces around them to make a Super Bowl run. I mean, if the Packers and the Seahawks currently aren't winning Super Bowls with those teams, with those quarterbacks, I think there's a very slim chance that another team that gives up all the assets that they would need to give up would be able to legitimately have a good chance to win the Super Bowl with those players. I don't really want to talk about the Watson situation because that's still so much in the air. But one more thing about the veteran trade market that I'd like to consider is looking at that lower tier of free agent quarterbacks and those being the best ones available, but none of them are big targets. And that's Teddy Bridgewater, Jameis Winston, Marcus Mariota, Mitch Trubisky. I'm just wondering, does one of those guys get a shot to be the starter for a team next year? And if I were to pick one guy, I think I might pick is Jameis Winston. Unfortunately, the ACL tear I think was a big issue for him. I don't think teams are gonna want to take a third chance on him. Mariota, maybe, but it doesn't really seem that we're going that way. Bridgewater, I think, is a known commodity at this point, but I think teams could look at what Trubisky was coming out. I know we didn't like him, but there was still potential there. They know what happened in Chicago. It wasn't a good situation under Matt Nagy. And they could think, after a year of being in a healthy environment in Buffalo, learning under that coaching staff, under Josh Allen, maybe it's time to give Mr. Trubisky another shot. So once the dominoes all fall, I wouldn't be surprised if Trubisky ended up being a starter next year.
What if Brian Daboll brings in Mitch Trubisky to be some competition for Daniel Jones and potentially be, the starter if Daniel Jones falters? And, if both of them don't play well, they can take a quarterback next year. If Trubisky plays really well, then they have a potential quarterback of the future. And if Daniel Jones improves his play because of the competition, I mean, honestly, that just really came to me now. It could be a win-win situation for the Giants if they do bring in Mitch Trubisky, low-tier contract, potential starter, could push Daniel Jones, or they pick a QB next year.
I like the idea because, as I said, I would wait for the Giants on drafting a quarterback, and why not bring in that competition with that some sort of upside? Do I think they're going to do it? No, I think that they're giving Daniel Jones that extra chance full time to be their starter the next year.
Yeah, I think now we can move on to some of the other offensive positions. We'll move on to running back. I think to name a few notable free agency names, there's Melvin Gordon, Cordero Patterson, David Johnson, Leonard Fournette, Philip Lindsay, Raheem Mostert. Not too many big names. It seems like Cordero Patterson's going to get re-signed by the Falcons. But if you were a team, free agency or the draft for the running backs?
I'd go draft. It's not the best class, but some of these guys on this list are really at the tail end of their careers, and giving any type of cap space to a Melvin Gordon or David Johnson type is just not something that I would advise. This draft does have pretty good depth in rounds 2 to 4. I think that there's a lot of potential for quality starters, and especially guys who can be 1A or 1B in a 2 running back system. I'm thinking, for example, Zamir White. He's really doesn't have the receiving production, but he's a really good runner. On the other hand, his Georgia teammate James Cook can be a really good asset in the receiving game as the 1B to somebody else's 1A. So I think that there's a good amount of options in the draft, headlined by potential 3 down backs like Kenneth Walker and Isaiah Spiller. And even later, if you just need that second guy, you can take a guy like Cook or White.
Yeah, I think that's kind of really been how running backs have been treated the past couple of years. No need to really reiterate what you've said about the draft class, but no top tier guys like Najee Harris, but I do like a lot of the guys in the second, third, fourth rounds. And I think a guy like Kenneth Walker, Breece Hall could really be franchise running backs for 4 or 5 years for whichever team drafts them.
Absolutely. Now, wide receiver is a pretty interesting position because once again, we have a really strong wide receiver class, but it looks like there's going to be a couple big names hitting the open market. The big question mark is Devontae Adams, but outside of him, Chris Godwin seems likely to hit the open market. Allen Robinson is definitely on his way out of Chicago after a really disappointing year. And then there's Calvin Ridley, who seems to be on his way out on the trade block out of Atlanta. My tendency would be to avoid the spending big money for one of these wide receivers, despite how good they are, because it's another quality class. We've seen the impact that young receivers have made in the league. Some of the best receivers in the league, like Justin Jefferson, like Deebo Samuel, like Jamar Chase, are on rookie contracts. So I think that's the easy answer, except in a few situations where maybe you're New England and your draft history at wide receiver. You don't want to put yourself in a position where you have to draft wide receiver in the draft, but that getting a big time wide receiver would really help Mac Jones's development. Maybe then you take a swing at a Chris Godwin or a Calvin Ridley.
So I kind of have a little bit of a different take on this than you. If I were a team with a young rookie quarterback, I'm thinking, the Bears, the Jets, the Jaguars, even the Patriots, like you said, and maybe even, the 49ers. I would strongly consider signing one of these, a big name, talented free agent wide receivers. And here's why. We saw it in Buffalo. We saw Stephon Diggs was traded for. You can argue to what made Josh Allen improve the most, but Diggs was definitely a huge part of that. And having a established wide receiver one that can not only help the quarterback on the field, but even watching film sometimes, wide receivers might see some things that a quarterback or a rookie or a young quarterback doesn't. I'd argue that bringing in one of these high-end free agent wide receivers to teams that are usually bad and have a lot of cap space in general might help the development of that young rookie quarterback. Now, if I was one of the, say, 25 other teams that doesn't have a young rookie quarterback, I would go to the draft. It's been, 3 years in a row now at least where we've had very deep, very strong wide receiver classes. And, this year is no different. A ton of very good wide receivers. So draft for most teams. But if I was a team with a young rookie quarterback, again, I would strongly consider that high-end free agent that has the talent that could potentially help the evolution of your quarterback.
I think especially if you're picking in the top 10, because we could see the whole top tier of wide receivers go in the latter portion of round one. And then once it's your turn to pick again, top of round two, you're kind of looking at that next group, and maybe you're not as confident of them having as big of an impact as you'd hope for your young quarterback that you're developing. So it definitely makes some sense. But, there's also some cautionary tales like Kenny Golladay, who got such a big contract from the Giants, and it hasn't been working out thus far. So I think the overall wide receiver in the draft is just safer because there's so much upside, there's so much ability, so much depth, and you're not allocating that much money to it, and you could have an even greater impact.
And why not take a few? I think we talked about this a few weeks ago. Take a few flyers in rounds 2, 3, and 4. Your odds are going to hit on one.
Give me a guy like Sky Moore, John Mechie, Khalil Shakir. There's a lot of good flyers.
Yeah, let's move on to tight ends now. Doesn't really seem like a super deep free agent tight end class, headlined by guys like Zach Ertz, Jimmy Graham, Rob Gronkowski, who, I'm surprised he's not retired. You said that as well. CJ Uzoma, Eric Ebron, really, in my opinion, weak free agent tight end class.
It's weak, but a couple of these guys could make a team better. And there's few cases of rookie tight ends making an impact. I think if you're signing Zach Ertz or CJ Uzama to a 1-year deal, it wouldn't be really costly. And I think that they could provide veteran experience and some productivity that you might not be getting from a rookie tight end. It's a good rookie tight end class, but I think a lot of those rookies are going to pay dividends in 2-3 years rather than right away. So obviously, I think that there's definitely potential for immediate impact. I really like guys like Trey McBride. Also really like Greg Dulcich. I think he's a big sleeper prospect. But if you're looking for immediate impact, it's never safe to go the tight end route in the drafts. I wouldn't be against some of these low cost 1 year deals for a guy like Ertz or Uzoma for a team that's on the higher end and really competing for a Super Bowl.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I just said that it was a weak tight end class because it is, but I agree with what you said about, rookie tight ends not really making the impact year one. Kyle Pitts was an anomaly. He had, one of the best rookie tight end seasons ever, and he does not get enough credit for that whatsoever. But you're right. Guys like Zach Ertz, even Jimmy Graham could bring a veteran presence and to any team really, maybe a team that's looking to get over the hump or a team that's looking for a tight end to be a nice outlet, reliable receiver for a young quarterback. And, they've played on winning teams. A guy like CJ Uzama, I feel like he's going to return to the Bengals. So I feel like he kind of is going to get taken off the market. But I think even Eric Ebron, I mean, he was a top 10 pick in 2014, I think. So he hasn't really lived up to that billing, but he had that really good season where he led the league in touchdowns. So who knows what happens with a guy like Eric Ebron? But I'd look towards, honestly, if I was a team, I'd go both directions. If I needed a tight end, I would take one in the draft for the future and sign one in free agency for the now.
I'm going to give the same answer for our next position group, offensive line. And I think to even greater extent, if you've got offensive line problems, you can't look at either or. It's got to be both. We've seen that, like, the Chiefs completely remake their offensive line using both the draft with Creed Humphrey and Trey Smith, but also free agency, like the big signing of Joe Thuney, and it worked. They got a much better offensive line. So if you're a team like the Bengals, you've got to go both routes. There's good options in the offensive line free agency class. I'm thinking Brandon Scherf is an elite option. And beyond that, there's some veterans that maybe getting to the wrong side of the age spectrum, but still have a lot to offer, like Andrew Norwell, like Teron Armstead, like Dwayne Brown, like Ryan Jensen. So take one or two of those guys and then add one or two players in the draft, and you can really remake your offensive line. And I really like the offensive line class for the draft, both on the outside and the interior. You can find quality starters in day two, in my opinion.
Yeah, I'm not going to reiterate what you said. You got to go both if your offensive line is in need of an upgrade. There's some, like you said, quality guys on the offensive line, especially on the interior. I think you have Brandon Scherf, Ryan Jensen, Matt Paratus, all either very good or solid interior offensive linemen. If I was a team that was a Super Bowl contender that was in need of one or two pieces along the offensive line, I'd probably go to free agency just because those guys are probably a little bit more reliable. Sometimes rookie offensive linemen, especially if they're picked outside the first round, can be a little shaky their rookie year. But if I was in need of a full offensive line rebuild, like the Bengals are in need of this year, they have to go to free agency and they have to go to the draft to make that offensive line as good as they possibly can.
I think that a general point to remember is that free agency comes before the draft. If you've got big needs, you have to look to free agency first because you don't know how the board is going to fall on draft night. I know we're big believers in best player available. So a lot of these positions, it is more valuable to look towards the draft. But if it's a glaring need and you're a team that can contend, go fill it in free agency first and then fill in the pieces or really go best player available and bolster your team in any direction in the draft, because that's just the order of the NFL calendar. Now, moving on to edge, I think if you're hitting a home run, then you go free agency with a guy like Chandler Jones. Otherwise, man, this draft class is so good on the edge. It's so deep. You've got talent all the way at the top: Hutchinson, Thibodeau, Karlaftis, Ojabo, Jermaine Johnson, Trayvon Walker, Boye Mafe, and then day two, there's so many guys that can be quality starters like Cameron Thomas, Arnold Ebiketie, Majai Sanders. So, I mean, I think that you can really bolster your pass rush in the draft this year. So I wouldn't be committing too much money and overpaying too much on the edge like we've seen in previous years.
Yeah, you're right. I think maybe you'll target the top guys in free agency along the edge. Maybe a guy like Von Miller has another year or two left in the tank. He played very well for the Rams down the stretch. Definitely was an impact player. So a guy like Von Miller, you mentioned Chandler Jones. A guy like Calais Campbell might have another year or two left in the tank, and he's a massive guy on that defensive line. Maybe a guy like Jadeveon Clowney you can take a swing at. He's been banged up. He'll probably be on the cheap. And if he has a full healthy season, I think that could be a potential home run hit in free agency. But like you said, this draft class for the edge is so deep. We talked about it a couple weeks ago in our Q&A. Just talent all throughout the board. There's potentially 6 edge guys that might go in the top 20. Um, and it doesn't really fall off after that. Obviously, the talent is going to get less, but it's still very deep throughout the draft.
Yeah, and I think the same goes for a defensive tackle. It's really remarkable. This isn't like wide receiver where we're saying it's a really strong class, but that's been the case for about 3 years running. Defensive line is not generally a class that is really good in every draft class, so you got to take advantage of it when it is.
Yeah, totally. I think, free agency is a little weak along the defensive line, headlined by guys like Ndamukong Suh, Linval Joseph, who are older, and a guy like Larry Ogunjobi for the Bengals. I think he might be a dark horse to get franchise tagged just because he was instrumental to that defense throughout the whole season. But you said it. The defensive tackle class of this draft is super deep. There's no guys, in the top 10, but you have, all the 2 defensive linemen from Georgia, Devontae Wyatt and Jordan Davis. You have Travis Jones from UConn, Perrion Winfrey from Oklahoma State, and those are all day 2 guys that could really, or possibly day 1 for the Georgia guys, but late day 1, day 2 guys that could make impact at the next level really early on.
Totally agree. And looking at the linebacker class now, free agency, it's looking a little bleak, honestly. Dante Hightower is really on towards the end of his career. Then you've got solid starters like Anthony Hitchens, Anthony Barr, Leighton Vander Esch, but I don't know how much value there is in these second contracts. So for linebacker, I think this is one of my strongest takes of go to the draft because you've got the first round talent and Devin Lloyd and Nakobe Dean. I think both of them are going to slide way past where they should. It just seems like linebackers don't go as high as they deserve sometimes in round 1. And even beyond that, I really like some of these day 2 linebackers. I think Chad Muma and Darian Beavers are great targets in the second round range. Quay Walker should be a solid starting linebacker in the NFL too. Damone Clark, I would say the same thing. So it's a better linebacker class than people are giving it credit for. So I think that teams can definitely look to the draft to improve the second level of their defense this year.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. You named off some of the free agents that are the top of the linebacker class, and pretty underwhelming. I agree with you. I'd go straight to the draft if I was in need of a linebacker. I might just completely, ignore free agency just because of, like you said, how deep the draft is and how shallow the free agent class is at linebacker.
Yeah, linebacker isn't a position where if you pass on it for agency, you're pigeonholing yourself into that position in round 1 because I think deep into day 2 you can get quality starters at the position this year. Now, cornerback is a position where I think I'd also tend to look towards the draft. I think if J.C. Jackson becomes available out of New England, you've got to pounce because I think he's a lockdown cornerback. He's shown that over the past few years, and New England would be foolish to let him go, really. But I like the draft class at cornerback. I think that there's a good amount of guys at the really, especially the round 2 or the round 1, round 2 turn. So that's both for teams that were close to being in the Super Bowl and teams that are rebuilding that can target those positions. I'm thinking guys like Trent McDuffie, Roger McCreary, Kyler Gordon, Andrew Booth. I think they can all be good starters in the NFL. So for teams at different points in the draft order, I think that cornerback is pretty interesting in the draft.
I think if you were a Super Bowl contending team, you might look towards free agency. Obviously, like you said, J.C. Jackson becomes available. Any team in need of a cornerback, which is pretty much every team in the league, should pounce on that opportunity. But I feel like a guy like Stephon Gilmore, Joe Hayden, even Chris Harris and Patrick Peterson could provide 1 to 2 more years of quality play for a Super Bowl contending team. But, like you said, that round 1, round 2 turn, definitely a lot of talent there. And even at the top of the draft, with the 2, Derek Stingley and Ahmad Gardner, 2, I think, very good cornerback prospects. So, maybe if you're a team in the top end of the draft is in need of a cornerback, if you pass on one of those guys, you should be able to get a very quality player at the top of round 2. So I think Super Bowl contending team that needs maybe a cornerback too, maybe go to free agency. But I think really any team in need of a cornerback could also look to the draft.
Yeah. Now for the last position, safety, I think this is a position where I like the free agent class. I think that safety is also a position that gets underpaid in free agency compared to other positions. It seems like the narrative that safeties aren't that valuable still persists in the NFL, even though it's really not that true. Safeties can have such a big impact, especially if you get that rare type of safety that's really reliable and talented in coverage, both against running backs and against tight ends. That's a big asset to your team. And if you look at the safety class, you've got guys like Tyrann Mathieu, Devin McCourty. I mean, it'd be weird to see him outside of New England, but he still is in that list. And outside of that, Marcus Williams, Marcus May, Quandre Diggs, Kareem Jackson. These are all guys that are good starters in the league and that won't command the type of money that other position players will command based on their relative ability, because safety just doesn't get paid much. So this is a class where I would be looking towards free agency, especially because in the draft outside of Kyle Hamilton, I like a few guys. I like Daxton Hill. I like Jaquan Brisker. But all in all, that there's too few of them that I think are going to be immediate quality starters in the NFL, that if I had any at safety, I would be looking towards free agency.
Yeah, I completely agree with you here. I think, you mentioned the two, Tyrann Mathieu and Devin McCourty. I think they could be two really good leaders, veteran leaders for, Super Bowl contending teams. But then you mentioned the guys Marcus Williams, Marcus May, Quandre Diggs, and Kareem Jackson. Those are four guys that are relatively young going into, year 5 or 6 of their career. And, that's where a lot of guys, especially safeties, tend to hit their prime just because, sitting back there, it might take a little while to adjust to NFL offenses and be able to read offenses as quickly as they do. And they still have that top end athletic ability in year 4 and 5. So I think they're young guys. And you mentioned free agent safeties don't, contend for as much money as cornerbacks, edge rushers, wide receivers do. So I definitely think safety is a really good position to look into for free agency this year.
Yeah, Jackson is 33 and Diggs is 29, but I think that point especially stands for Marcus Williams and Marcus May. Their best football is ahead of them, and I think that those could be really good value contracts for a lot of teams in the league.
Yeah, I think that wraps us up pretty much. We went through all the positions, and I think we did this last year as well, and I think we're going to come to the same conclusion. If you're normally a younger team, look towards the draft and look towards, if you're a Super Bowl contending team, you can look towards free agency to kind of fill in the cracks, maybe provide that last little boost to get you to the next level.
Yeah, I think at all levels, you want to put yourself in a position to go best player available in the draft. You just do have to be aware of how these classes stand between free agency and the draft so that you know how to allocate your cap space. And I think that's what we've covered in this episode, talking about the relative strengths of each of these positions in the free agency and the draft. So it's going to be interesting to see how teams end up judging these situations and making decisions on where to attack their needs.
And we're full into draft season now. The combine is just a couple days away. I think players have started making their way to Indianapolis.
Yep.
Drills start on Wednesday. They go Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, I think.
I think it's Thursday, Friday, Saturday.
Okay, so Thursday, Friday, Saturday. Definitely be super interesting. Next week, we'll definitely be doing a combine recap. And, you'll probably see some shakeups, some guys that probably will rise due to their combine performances, and some guys that might fall and, may not be, worth the fall.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a really exciting podcast episode. So make sure to join us next Monday for the combine recap after all these blazing 40-yard dashes and everything. So thanks for joining us tonight, and we'll see you next Monday.